and welcome back to This is Dundermoose. I'm really excited to bring you our next guest, Mr. Alchemic Raker, the one and only, the one who put Harmony Ginger onto the idea of a Godstein, and the rest is history. You have been busy. You got the Old Lords. You've got HellMarch. Maybe we should start. Well, let's start with the latest thing. Tell me a little bit about HellMarch. How did you get the idea for this product, and how has it been going since you? I mean, you only put it out like a couple days ago, right?
Yeah, and yeah, thanks for having me on. So last year, I've been kind of studying D&D in reverse, and this has been like just a bug in my mind trying to figure RPGs out for like the last 15 years.
Right.
And I never imagined it would take me back to pre-WotC days. And I actually had like a bias against. I don't want to play like the really old versions of the D&D. I want the new stuff.
Yeah.
But
The stuff with the tiny print, the weird font.
Yeah.
I don't want to read that.
So it went back to AD&D. Eventually went back to OD&D, and then I never imagined.
How long did it take for you to get past AD&D to OD&D? Because I feel like AD&D is so rich, you can get caught there.
It is. I didn't play a whole lot of AD&D though.
Oh, okay.
So I've played some, but I reread the Dungeon Master's Guide, I think 3 or 4 times.
Wow.
Over the course of a couple of months, and I kept trying to read it and reread it and understand it to like really get the juice in it.
Yeah.
And it didn't click at first. It didn't click the second time, and I don't know when exactly I got the how to win at D&D.
Right on.
But got through that and finally went back and read it with just like a blank slate of expectations in my mind. It's like there's stuff in here I have no idea about. Like I have to take everything it says and believe it and like give it a chance without pushing my own expectations on it. And so it wasn't until like the 3rd and 4th times that I read it that's like, whoa, just everything is revealed. Stuff that made no sense.
Yeah.
Is completely clear, but only once I went in with a blank mind.
That's interesting, because I feel like a lot of people have that experience too, where they go in thinking, I know what D&D is. I know what tabletop role-playing games are. And when they start reading it, they run into that turbulence where they're like, this is weird. Like, Questing Beast. He had been, I don't know if he's still doing it, but he was doing a series where he was reading out of the DMG. He'd get a glass of beer, he'd get the DMG, and he was just going to read it into, for his YouTube channel. And I was listening to this while I was mowing the lawn, because I was like, man, what a great thing to listen to when I got to do a chore, right?
Yeah.
And like the whole time he's reading, it started really irritating me, because I could hear him scoffing, like he would just like sigh and he'd go, Gary. Like he knows the heck more than Gary friggin' Gygax. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I'm like, what's going on here? What is this? But like from hearing you talk about that, I'm like, maybe I was really too harsh on the guy. If you think you know what D&D is and you jump straight into that DMG book, there's cognitive dissonance there.
It's a completely foreign game, and it won't match your expectations. If you watch some D&D YouTube, which is what I was doing, for probably 3 years, so I played D&D in college, and then took some break from it, and then I was getting back into it with I guess it was mainly D&D YouTube, and then that kind of got me into the OSR YouTube space. And the advice in there is, I mean, it sounds deceptively good if you're not playing. And I wasn't playing at the time, so it's like, okay, here's what the latest versions are, and apparently these are the new tricks that work.
Yeah.
And so I was just kind of in that for a little bit, but it was different than what I played in college. And in college, I'd played 3.5 edition. And
I never got to play that. I just started with 5th and then jumped straight back to 1E.
So I tried running 5th edition games and that D&D advice, rolling around in my mind, and it's just not working. Never did work. And I don't know, it's probably about that time that I got onto Twitter and started, meeting people there. When I've got,
You fell in with the wrong crowd, didn't you?
Well,
hang on.
I went.
Hold that thought. We do have a super sticker from My Ear Trumpet Has Been Struck by Lightning. Thank you for the $1 dues, my bro. It was good to be back with you, and thanks for the super sticker.
Yeah. So 5th edition didn't click, and the advice just wasn't working, and like something's nagging me. Like, what's wrong? I played for a 2-year campaign in college. Whenever I was brought in, I was brought into a 2-year campaign. And then immediately after that, I went to run Anima Beyond Fantasy. So it's not a D&D game. It's a
I've not heard of that
percentile. It's like anime, anime fantasy RPG. I really enjoyed it, but it's hard to recommend it because it's got a lot of crunch, and it's twice translated to get to English, so it's like a real mess to understand.
Josh and you asks, "Is this Black Lunch Games?" No, sorry, man. You showed up at the wrong spot.
Yeah.
So JRPG.
Yeah. But it was fun. Like if you really want some anime thing where you can design your own Dragon Ball Z moves or charge up magic to cast giant fireballs and stuff. It does that stuff. It's cool, but
I mean,
it's really hard to recommend.
It's kind of like spells, right? Where they like have to say the name of the move before they do it.
Yeah, like you could pick and choose, and it was point by,
okay.
Which anyway, but I went to that and I ran a 2-year campaign of that on my first try. So I've got like two examples of campaigns that lasted until the group physically moved away.
Yeah.
Right. It was just like a hit, and there wasn't any trouble running games. And then 10 years later, I'm taking this YouTube advice and trying to run 5th edition. It's not working.
Yeah.
It's not working at all. Like,
and you're like, what changed?
Yes, it's just completely different. Maybe the advice that the DMs get is different. The people playing the games, like their expectations are set differently. And it's not just YouTube advice. It's just all of our modern media. Like there is a shift in what people want to do in game together. But and so when I was going back, I was like, I didn't want to play 3rd edition again. I was really disenchanted with it, honestly, after the end of the 2-year campaign we had. Like really fun playing with those guys, but I took personal issues with the system.
Oh, wow, okay.
Yeah, I felt very strongly about it at the time, and that's lessened a little bit. But so I was like, all right. I think it was around the time I found the Basic Experts server.
Okay.
And
is this where we get to the part where you tell us that you got bullied by proxy from Crafty?
That's coming up.
All right,
let's go ahead and go.
No spoilers.
So I was with the Basic Experts Gilded server, and like, okay, these are people that are really studying the game, and the bros, and there's this kind of feud about what are the rules for. Are you playing rules as written, or are you using rule 0? And you can get like super pedantic about, well, is rules as written mean that you can interpret sometimes? And I think if you approach the concept of rule 0 honestly, like there's places you're supposed to say this rule clearly does not apply in this situation. Like I know it says for swords, but you're trying to prop open a door with her. So like this is not when you're supposed to use that rule. So we're going to make a better call for it. But I think what more strongly is the point is the rules are a vital part of the game.
Yeah.
And it is through the execution of the game mechanics and yielding part of your experience to those mechanics is like, there's a chance that this isn't going to work. And that's important to the story we're trying to tell, what we're trying to get through. And so the mechanics are are important. And a lot of time when someone says raw, that's what they're expressing. Like, the rules matter here, guys. We can't just throw them out. We're trying to get something out of it. And that's why you feel strongly about rules, or else you wouldn't buy a rule book in the first place.
That's right.
Like, they clearly serve some purpose.
Recognizing that no rule set can cover the wide range of all possible imagination, right?
Yeah.
So there are going to be places where the rules are silent, and that's what Rule Zero is for.
Yeah.
And for everything else, there's raw.
Yeah. It and the raw enhances the game because it will say, oh, you're going to, your assassin's going to go try to assassinate someone, and there's step by step about how that's going to work, and it might fail at some point, and then the mechanics tell you when and how, and and because there's mechanics as a player, now you're thinking about it. It's like, oh, if I'm gonna try an assassination mission, there's mechanics for how I disguise and how I learn information about it. And so now I'm not just going to say, oh, I go send an assassin. It's like, no, now I'm going to make sure that he's equipped with these things, and I'm
Yeah.
going to make sure I give him like it. The mechanics make you a better player and make a better story. Like,
Yeah.
you have to have those. Because not everyone can do that. Like, I don't think about all those things whenever I'm like, oh yeah, I'm going to go send an assassin at him. It's like, the mechanics increase the creativity by expecting more of the players.
Yeah. And forcing
Yep.
them to engage and be in the world.
Yeah.
Making them use their imagination.
Yeah.
Right?
It's and so yeah, so I never took the whole Rule Zero thing where they say, we can ignore the rules whenever we want to tell a better story, and that never sat well. So
Yeah.
I found these people that
there's a certain type of play that holds story as the ultimate.
Yeah.
Like, everything should be in service of the story, and then it makes you wonder, well, what do you mean when you say story? Right?
Right. And it's weird because I would say the same thing as I'm playing by the rules of the game for the story as well, because this is going to be a better story for it.
Yeah.
So we're seeing different ways to get there.
Yeah.
But
that's a great way of putting it.
But we see that the rules are in service of telling an even better story than whatever it is you planned out. Because, what if you do fail to kill the big bad guy on the final mission? Like, well, that's an even better cliffhanger than you could have planned.
Right.
It's every single one of these failures that you think is going to destroy the game is actually going to make it that much better. What happens if you don't have a tent in the forest? Well, now you got to find a cave, and what's living there? The entire adventure right there, because you forgot a tent. Like,
I had Alexander McCrease on the first time he was on. He told a story about his party went up against the big bad, and everyone got wiped but one dude. He had a ring of regeneration or whatever. So the big bad wiped the party, gloated, stomped off, and then he resurrected himself and then put all their bodies in his bag of holding and was able to completely save the whole TPK situation because the big bad because McCrease forgot that he had that ring, right? So that's a better story than if it just goes according to plan and you kill the big bad on your final hit point like everyone knew was going to happen.
Yeah.
Right.
So I'd gone back. I told you, I read the first edition DMG multiple times, read the entire core set of first edition again after I was starting to understand it. And I like it. It's honestly a bit crunchy for my own preference, and it's hard. It's hard for me to imagine bringing it to the table with a lot of the modern players. And
well, because you know the resistance you had trying to learn the game,
right?
And now you're thinking about how am I going to drag them through this when they've got all these assumptions about mediocre D&D. What's the best way to piece that out? So one of your solutions was I'm going to go even older. I'm going to go even simpler. I'm going to start learning.
So I kept going back because, I mean, first edition amazed me so much. Like, there's so much amazing stuff in here that's been lost. So yeah, there's probably even more if I keep going further back. And it's like all the stuff I have been wondering about for 15 years about like what's the secret of RPGs and what's the secret of D&D, and suddenly it's all appearing in first edition. Nobody on YouTube's talking about it. Like nobody seems to get it. It's not in fifth edition. So I go all the way back. First edition, like the magic is in there. So I go even further back because I hear it's a bit simpler, and it's got even more magic in there. And unlike first edition, OD&D still shows you these nuts and bolts about how it was made, and it tells you up front as the game master that you might have to do more of that.
Yeah.
And it's not a complete game the way that first edition is. And so I very much respect first edition for being a complete game as it is. But OD&D asks more of you to make it happen. Seeing Crafty Matt here.
Yeah, Crafty Matt says, you even tried to study AD&D before the discovery of the Dunder method.
Yeah.
I appreciate Crafty calling it the Dunder method. I did a video on how to read them. It's the books themselves tell you that the DMG lines up with the player's handbook, and you should read them in tandem. But I appreciate it. If you guys want to call it the Dunder method, I'll take credit, I guess.
Well, people don't know that going into it because they're not used to reading.
That's true.
They're used to the modern approach to RPGs where, oh, we're underwater. Well, I'm just gonna pretend that we're gonna make up underwater fighting rules now and not even check if they're in the book
on
or
the
if there
spot.
is.
Yeah.
So where you just pick and choose what rules you want to read that day, even you're not really applying it, which was also at contrast to how I played in 3.5 edition. We'd have a giant battle laid out, and my DM wasn't afraid. We'd have 50 combatants on the map that were going to fight through, and that was just one part of. We'd play for 6 hours.
I was gonna say
weekly, all of that fun stuff, right?
This is 5e or third edition.
That was 3.5e.
Okay, I was gonna say 50 combatants, and each one of them gets an action, a bonus action, and a reaction. Like that would take forever.
No, not the whole bonus action nonsense. It's you get a full attack, or you get an action and a move, and the action could be a single attack.
Oh, okay.
So a bit easier to manage, but my DM was still tracking HP for each one of those NPCs.
Wow, that's a lot of scratch paper.
But all the players knew the rules. We all knew the rules, and we check each other on it too. Like we didn't have to pull out the books because we were reading the books in between the play sessions. Right. We were all totally into it.
You guys were good players.
And we weren't just using the core books. We had the whole line of complete splat books for this is the warriors, this is the adventurers, and we were mixing it all up. But we knew all of them, and we played rules as written the entire time.
Right on. It's such a self enforcing problem where the DM doesn't read, and then the players don't have any incentive to learn it that way because they know the DM is just going to make something up to fit the story in their head in the moment. Yeah. And so it's like, why am I going to bother learning all these rules that the guy's not even going to use anyway, right?
Yeah. So we get back to OD&D, and I'm studying it to find out what's in there, and it shows you the nuts and bolts, which I really appreciated being able to learn from. And one of the core things in it that comes up over and over and over again is I think there's over 30 mentions of chainmail.
Yeah.
Like in all caps across the 3 core OD&D books. And it's listed in the recommended equipment. So like, okay, well that means it's optional. Yeah, it also includes players in that list.
Yeah,
and then imagination, right?
Yeah,
and
imagination.
dice.
Yeah,
you might need some of these things. Okay, and chainmail is the only thing bold in that list. And then it says you're going to do this. Use chainmail. It's like chainmail was clearly not optional. And everyone so far has told me it's optional. The same people who have been like lying to me about everything else says that chainmail is optional. I'm not listening to them. So after reading through OD&D, it's like I clearly can't fully understand this book unless I go to chainmail. And so that brought me to chainmail.
All right.
And
So this is kind of the beginning of everything. And I don't. There's only a few people online that I think of when I think of who has chainmail down. You're one of them. Purple Druid,
mhm,
R Dubs.
yep.
There's a couple more, and I'm not remembering them right now. But there's a vibrant community of you guys that are like digging in and playing chainmail and like seeking to understand it on a basic level.
Yeah, and there's so much in there. So my story will lead right into that. So I
Okay.
was reading Chainmail and trying to understand Chainmail, and
Because there's some
what
weird stuff in there, man. Right? Like
there's a lot of weird stuff in there.
you got to read your history book. Like you got to be like, what's a Swiss? What are these Swiss mercenaries?
Yeah, well, I mean that's the thing. If you're reading like the Swiss and the Swiss, and I'm gonna butcher it, the Landsknights and
Yeah,
like
Landsknecht
all those
or how do you
factions,
pronounce it?
it's not obvious if you're just reading the book, but those
Yeah,
were mercenaries. Like it doesn't say that they're mercenaries in the book. It says here's the Swiss, and here's some rules for mercenaries.
yeah,
But you have to do your research to know that those go together.
yeah. Well, and to know that they were like a very elite, special type of mercenary that changed warfare at the time.
Exactly. And so when you just read the Swiss rules in the book in Chainmail, they're so powerful.
Yeah,
And if you don't know that they're mercenaries, the
yeah,
mercenaries are like they're at half cost. So you're like, okay, that's pretty good. And then they have this random chance to abandon you or switch sides
yeah.
in Chainmail. And it's like, okay, like
And
that's a
they
bit of
don't
a
take
mixed
any
bag.
captives, right? They take no prisoners. They just kill
Yeah,
everybody because
yeah.
they're already going to
And
get paid.
and suddenly if you're like, okay, well the Swiss are mercenaries, so it applies to them. It's like, oh, okay, like now if you want to take that power, you got to take that risk with it,
Which
right?
to me makes it. I haven't finished Chainmail yet. It makes it hard for me to read it because I get fascinated and I go down a rabbit trail reading about the Swiss mercenaries and reading about the
Uh-huh.
Landsknecks and when they took over and the Pikes and the little villages that they lived in and how they would just drill and how they were better than everybody. And like I get into it and then I'm like, okay, so do I need Switzerland in my D&D campaign? Like
Yeah. Um, yeah. So I'm reading Chainmail, and uh, one of the ways I try to think through things and like really deeply understand them is by rewriting it myself.
yes.
And so I'm taking notes over here in my Google Doc as I'm reading through Chainmail, um, knowing at the end I'm going to have something that's kind of playable, and I'm planning on making my own RPG at some point. So I'll just take good notes and probably use something like this for it. Um, and I get through the core rules of chainmail, and at that point, I basically have the old lord's core rules written up
Yeah.
right there. I don't have the tables, but I've got like all the rules drafted right there. Um, and
I
it's
can
right about
throw
that
that up
time.
on the screen too if we want to talk
Yeah,
about old rules.
yeah. So it's right about that time that I have the old lords drafted, and um, and oh, sorry, it's right about that time that Crafty Matt is issuing this challenge to another member of the Basic Experts community to get stuff published, because they're on this kick where you design and design and design, but you don't you don't ever commit to publishing
Don't
something.
pull the trigger on
And
it. Yeah.
um, and I felt that very deeply because I was in about a decade-long stint of that as well, where I'd design a bit, then I'd shelve it, and then I'd design a bit, and I'd shelve that. So I've got so many unfinished projects. But I'm sitting here looking at the core rules of chainmail that I've just written up, and he's issued this challenge.
Yeah.
They're like,
You're like,
okay,
all right, slam
all
dunk.
right, I got to get in on this. And it's like a 2-month deadline or something. It's like, okay, I can do that. So
Did you
that was
already know like about publishing? Did you have to learn any new software to lay it out or
I
um
was using the home brewery thing where you can type in missing the name for markdown format stuff. So it's kind of a code
oh,
format they use on Wikipedia,
okay.
and it formats it to look like uh, the 5th edition style of their
Nice.
handbooks, and it did a
With the watermarked background, like the watercolor stain sepia.
yeah, and it was a nice consistent format. So that took care of a lot of the need for um, a lot of the layout and design work was just
Okay.
kind of off 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 offloaded onto being able to use this code to kind of generate the pages. So I don't know, you can bring it up and see that like it looks pretty well laid out. I'm
It
proud
looks
of it.
beautiful. I love the picture. Like you get this. Is that a woman running a cannon?
Yeah. And
Do not mess with her.
and yeah, so I was able to put this together fairly quickly, I think, for someone with no previous experience doing it. I don't want to do it again because it wasn't easy to export this as a PDF.
Yeah.
At the end of it. So
I mean, this is a big document. You got a lot of imagery. Oh, I love that.
This is all public domain art.
Cool.
It's I was so like, and you know, enough consistent style in there. If you zoom in on here on at the top right, just below the picture, I've got an example in there. So the whole time that I'm reading Chainmail, I'm imagining how this is used with OD&D.
Yeah.
And every time it's these situations that you can imagine happening in D&D, and you can play it out with chainmail, with just the chainmail rules. So it's, you know, you've got some NPC that's sneaking in somewhere, or maybe it's your character. You don't have to have an entire character sheet for there to be able to be nuance in what you're doing.
Okay.
Because it's enough that you're in that scenario, and chainmail doesn't give rules about how to like set up scoring or anything for your games. It has a little bit about terrain, but mainly you can just take any D&D scenario and model it in chainmail and see how it plays out. And so just theater of the mind, oh, you know, you've got a thief here and, you know, he's within shooting distance of some guards in a guardhouse. You can play that. That's enough information. Now you can play that out in chainmail.
Cool.
And so I was...
And it's all D6s, right? It doesn't have all the polyhedrals?
Exactly. It's all D6s. So you're either going to roll like a pool of dice and count the number of hits, or you're going to roll 2d6 and check that on a table to see if it hits a target number.
Cool.
So
now, so there are two. Like there's man to man, and then there's like the
mass
unit
combat.
unit. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mass combat. So are you saying that the man to man rules are the ones that you could just easily swap in and out of OD&D, or are they the same?
Oh man.
Or did I just open a can of worms?
so there's a little can of worms there. So we're looking at man-to-man combat, and man-to-man combat was made for so you'd have big mass battles, and you have like a siege on a castle, because that's a pretty neat scene. And Gygax had just done that at some convention. He's like, oh, you know, the siege thing was really cool, so we need to have some way to handle that. And so you've got these big units fighting each other, but what if one man reaches the top of the ladder and gets on the wall?
Yeah.
Let's make that cool too. And so he invented these man-to-man combat rules for that instance. Like suddenly that one guy at the
swashbuckling sword fight down the staircase.
Yeah, and so now that guy matters, and that's where the man-to-man combat rules came from.
Interesting.
And these were for normal men. Like this is just some rando troop made it to the top, and now he really matters. And if you scroll to the next page, I think there's the big weapon table. Yeah, and
the top one or the bottom?
Yeah, the top one right there. And there you have this weapons versus the different kind of armor with and without shield.
Yeah.
And I know
this
immediately
from first edition to me. Yeah.
Exactly. You see this in first edition. But here it was just for normal man-to-man combat. Just average, and so already there's strategy in here for, okay, we just zoomed in on one person, but there's still a lot of nuance in what they have going on. About, you know, what weapon are they have, what armor do they have. Just below here, there's the weapon classes. So you might get multiple attacks even if your weapon's shorter, but the longer weapon's going to get to attack you first until you close on them, and then you have the shorter weapon, so you're going to be attacking first after that. Like there's so many little nuances that they baked into here.
Because they were doing PvP, they were doing player against each other, so they wanted to make it as accurate as to how an actual battle would go. Because that's one of the things that will kick you out of a game if you're imagining it and you're trying to picture in your head what's going on, and then the rules preclude you from doing something that you feel like you should be able to do in this scenario, then that's going to kick you out and be like, oh, well, we don't really have a rule for that. So, but then when you apply it, because it's PvP, you got to do rules as written so that it can be fair, so that both sides can agree, and it's not I got you, no, I got you, right? I feel like that's what a lot of the people that look for the easy out on Rule Zero is. They're not thinking in terms of PvP, and so they think it's all fair. It's just whatever the DM wants.
Right. Well, there's also the idea of player mastery. So it's not me versus the DM. What I want the DM is to present me a fair fight, or not like a fair fight, but I want them to be a fair referee.
Yeah.
You know, I decided how deep I wanted to get into this mess. That's for me to decide that risk level that I want to take, right? And then I don't want the GM hand waving it and making it easier. I want to get into the mess. I want to take the right amount of risk. I was a player. I'm smart. I calculated that. I went right into the Hydra's lair. What do you think I'm going to find there? I'm going to find a Hydra, and I want to fight a Hydra.
Yeah.
I don't want to fight. I
don't want to be scared when I do it.
Yeah, and I want to demonstrate my mastery of the rules by beating this Hydra.
Yeah.
You know, it tests my mastery of the rules, and if it's not going well, yeah,
it means so more if everybody knows what a Hydra can do, right?
Yeah, and you know, while it's other people's turns or whatever, I've got the rule book open, making sure that I can move, attack, and then move again, because that's going to be critical to not dying this turn, right? And all the players are reinforcing their understanding of the game while they're doing this. So, so this is man-to-man combat. If you scroll down, it's going to be several pages down. So there's factions. All the different things we talked about there, like the Swiss are in there somewhere. The mercenaries.
Yeah, they had the Swiss and the Landsknecht. I don't know if I'm saying that right.
I don't know. And we keep going. It's a little ways down to the fantasy combat header.
Right.
Past that. Fantasy creatures and
undead, dragons, heroes.
5 or 6 more pages, I think.
Okay. Tell me when I'm getting close.
Right there.
All right.
So this is fantastic combat. So in the middle of a battlefield, you've got like big units of men fighting each other, and there's special rules for that. We'll get around to mass combat. Everyone knows that's coming. You've got man-to-man combat for when that one guy really matters. He just climbed the tower, and he's got to fight through each of those guards to let the gate down or whatever.
Push off the other ladders or dump the oil or whatever.
Exactly, and there's siege rules for that too. There's boiling oil and everything in chainmail. So that's one kind of combat, but there's also this fantastic combat where you've got heroes and superheroes. So that would be someone like Conan. You've got giants and ogres and dragons that are all on here, and they're not using man-to-man combat. They're not normal men. So you're not being like, well, does the axe or the sword work better against the dragon? That's not the question here.
Yeah.
It's are you a puny little hero, or are you a superhero, or are you a wizard? Like, which one of those classes are you? That's deciding how good you are at fighting the dragon.
Yeah.
And that's what this encodes. And so maybe an elemental is stronger or weaker at fighting a dragon. It's not just a single scale of armor class the way it is in D&D, because then you haven't encoded that maybe the fire elemental is a lot stronger than or has a lot better chance of defeating a tree ant, because he's going to burn it down. And okay, well, you do double damage in D&D, but we skip all of that because we're fighting a big battle here. We're zoomed out. We want to know which side wins, but we also want to move on because there's more to do here today. And if you're thinking more in like the Fafford and Gray Mauser Appendix N stories, those are episodic. They do entire adventures in each chapter.
Yeah.
Right. And that's That's what you've got going on a battlefield. We don't want to know exactly how much HP the dragon has left. Did the hero defeat the dragon or not? He's going to punch the dragon, and then he's got to go over here because he's still got to rescue the princess when he's done.
You don't want to be filling in all the little BattleTech armor bubbles on the dragon's left arm or right rear leg from where he got hit with the magic missile. You're just like, my imagination can work out the fight. I just need to know who won, right?
Yeah.
How much damage they did and who won.
Yeah, and so that's what this was about for the war game.
Okay.
So you could have, you know, dragon versus superhero, and you could roll 2d6, and you know, maybe that pushes the dragon back or defeats him. Maybe it doesn't. Now the dragon's going to attack you, and maybe he's just going to eat you right there. Yeah.
We got Harmony in the chat. I've never heard Raker this excited talking about anything. I'm telling you, this is one of the go-to guys if you want to know about how this stuff works.
So, hey Harmony. So there's an entire system of combat for fantastic combat, and it's different. Like it is a separate system entirely from man-to-man combat.
I like how Troll is merely pushed back one move, not killed, because of that horrifying regeneration ability that the trolls have.
Yeah.
Hey Brian, never heard you talking. Brian Reninger, aka Fluid the Druid, in the chat. Welcome,
yeah, bro. Love it. So there's fantastic combat, and then up at the beginning of the book, there's mass combat. Like I said, we'll get to that. So when this gets included in OD&D, people think about it from the perspective of modern OD&D, or of modern D&D, where it's like, oh well, these are heroes fighting monsters, and they all use the same system. So they go into chainmail, and they skip straight to the man-to-man combat. And that kind of misleads them because they're used to seeing it in first edition. But the alternative combat system, the D20 combat that was introduced in original Dungeons and Dragons, was a replacement for fantastic combat. It was not a replacement for man-to-man combat.
Oh.
Because these are player characters. These are special.
All right, let's break it down again. Number one is mass combat.
Mass combat.
Regular troops versus regular troops of different varieties. Number two is man-to-man. When the siege is happening, one dude hits the top of the wall, and now we're zooming in on him.
Right.
And number three is kind of the Gygax part from the Perrin part, right? Is, okay, now how does a dragon work? Now how does a rock, like the giant eagles from Lord of the Rings, how does that play into it?
Right.
And so you're saying that the D20 system was not replacing man-to-man.
Right.
It was replacing the fantasy.
Yes. It was replacing the fantastic combat. So,
all right.
Can you scroll back to the fantastic combat table, and we'll zoom in on it?
Yeah.
Right in there. So we zoom in even more, and let's look at the row that says heroes, and take like the heroes versus an ogre as a 9.
Okay.
Right? And now we look at a superhero versus an ogre, and that's a 5.
Right.
All right. So if you go open up OD&D and you look at the fighter, at level 4, they're called a hero, and they have the fighting capability of a hero, and that's the fantastic combat. And once he hits level 8, once the fighter's level 8, he's a superhero. He's better at fighting that ogre. All right. And at level 3, he's a hero -1. And at level 5, he's a hero +1. So the fighting capability is already adding this kind of gradient advancement on the fantastic combat.
Mm-hmm.
And the alternative combat system with the D20 is all about heroes versus these creatures. So instead of having to just be 2 entries inside the fantastic combat table, now you've got 20 entries. You've got an entry for every level of the player, for each
level of the player.
So you've got that granularity for the player characters because they're going to be focused on the heroes.
Yeah.
And that's what the D20 combat was replacing the
fantastic
fantastic
combat. When did you figure
combat.
that out, and how did you feel when you realized it?
Oh man, Chainmail was a trip. Chainmail was a nonstop trip.
Right.
Seriously, it's crazy. So like discovering this fantastic combat. My perspective of wargamers, of at least this era of wargamers, changed entirely while I read this. If you scroll back up to the where it was the lady firing a cannon, that picture, that page has cannons and catapults on it, and
There
that
you
always
go.
seemed like a really tedious thing to me. Like you have like these wooden rods that you've painted with like black and white paint for different ranges,
Yeah,
and you have to
yeah.
lay that out on the table, and like that's just the nerdiest thing you've ever heard of, right? Like that's way too pedantic or whatever. But then when you read the rules of how you fire a catapult, it asks you. So yeah, in order to fire, the player must first call the distance ahead and the distance aside, after which you measure it to find out where the impact happens.
Okay.
All right, that's role playing.
Yeah.
That's role playing in your war game. And that's more role playing than you're doing in 5th edition when you're firing a catapult, when you're counting the squares and being like, oh no, it won't reach yet.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
no, you tell me how far you're firing that thing. You take a shot at it, see if you hit.
Yeah, you gotta like imagine turning the crank and licking your thumb and holding it up to the wind, right?
Yeah, and it might take a couple of shots for you to like really get it right, but they're moving their troops around, so you gotta guess again.
Yeah,
Um,
springs that
and
nerves.
yeah, and that's in chainmail. Like that's in the war game, or what we call the war game. Anyway, I'm sorry, I'm really getting into it.
Here's the
So
yardstick and dowels.
yeah, um, and so yeah, my perspective of all of it changed entirely. And it's like I immediately see how this could be used in original Dungeons and Dragons. If I stop trying to imagine original Dungeons and Dragons to be what I want it to be,
Yeah.
like what actually is it? It's actually all of this. And so it's not that players have to go and fight in big wars, but whenever you're trying to figure out some way into the castle, what if you trick some guy and turn that catapult around and
Yeah.
slingshot the fighter in? Like there's rules for that.
Dude, okay. So
There's rules for that now.
I just watched a video today, and I just shared it on a Twitter, where the guy was talking about how did Arneson come up with dungeons, and I don't know if this is true or not, but he said that it started with the same thing you're talking about with the man to man, that they were imagining a siege, and someone said, what if they send sappers to try and undermine the wall of the dungeon, or the wall of the castle? And Arneson was like, well, they would break through in the dungeons underneath the castle. And how would you defend against that? Well, you would fill all the dungeons with these death traps and defenses and stuff to keep them from getting in. And that's where the idea of the dungeon came from. So you're telling me the man-to-man rules, the fantasy rules, the dungeon rules, all of this stuff came up from imagining a war game, sieging a castle, and what happens to the guy that gets to the top of the ladder, or the guy that breaks through the wall? What does he see? What is he faced with? Man, that's crazy. I'm going to think about that for a second, but I'm also going to recognize Tag. Thanks, buddy. $10 super chat. This chainmail thing looks fun, he says.
You should try it sometime. It's a lot of fun.
I thought it
We're
would be
making fun right
before.
now. I play chainmail with this guy right now.
Okay.
He's running a chainmail game for me right now.
Yeah, I think he goes by a different name on Twitter than he does on YouTube. So he's probably a facetious comment because he probably already knows how fun it is.
Yes.
I hope you guys watching this are feeling the excitement though. Like this, it's black and white. It looks like an old game. It's still got some cool images and stuff. But don't sit here thinking, oh well, this is how they did it back in the days before they had Warhammer 40K or BattleTech. It's like, no, this is, if you read this stuff, you're gonna get lit up like my buddy Alchemic Raker is here talking about it.
Yeah. I mean, I highly recommend Chainmail. I also highly recommend the Old Lords, not just because I made it, but because it's hard to get into Chainmail now, 50 years later. Like, us modern role players don't get it. I came at it as a role player. There's a lot in there that just doesn't make sense. There's a lot that had to be decoded. A lot of what I've done in the Old Lords is taking data that's in like 4 or 5 different places and pulling it all together into one place where it actually makes sense.
Yeah.
And
So
like,
yeah, the layout and the organization, it is a
right.
little bit all over the place in the original.
And
I
and
noticed
so
that you also have some essays in there. It looked like towards the end talking about well, let's see. It is a big document. Um where was I? Here we
yeah, I
go.
have a couple of things in there. Yeah.
Always on campaigns and war games and TTRPGs, how they fit together and stuff. So, definitely the old Lords of Wonder and Ruin might be an easier entry point for people. Would you say that's a fair statement?
Absolutely. So and how I pitch the Old Lords is that it is chainmail uh for OD&D.
Okay, because
Like
it came out. Well, it came out at the same time as this book did, or
right.
roughly thereabouts. And I don't know if this was also part of that dare on the Basic Experts Gilded server. But so the Basic Expert came out with Wightbox, which is a play on
Hmm.
words. White box is what they called the original.
Yeah.
And this is his kind of his take on the ODD game. He adds a couple things. He puts the thief in. That I think didn't come until he talks about it in here. What did you time Old Lords to come out alongside this, or was that just kind of a serendipitous thing where
That was just incidental. That was
okay,
just incidental. And Whitebox also looks to chainmail for answers.
okay,
So I do
interesting.
recommend it. Like if you just want to get one retro clone and try to experience the original D&D without getting all the books, it's the best.
All
Like
right.
like it's really good. I highly recommend Whitebox. But if you want to go and experience the original, I recommend getting the original 3 OD&D books. They're
Hmm.
not that hard to understand. Just read what's written in them seriously, including the part where it says to play with chainmail,
Yeah.
and you'll be set. As for chainmail, I do recommend getting chainmail, but also get the Old Lords. It's free, seriously, and it will save you so much time in figuring out like how to use the tables and stuff that are in there. You'll find the equivalents in chainmail. You'll be right at home using the original rules for it, because the rules are that close. The only real changes in the Old Lords is a giant in chainmail would have like 11 hit dice, and in OD&D they had 8, so I set it to 8 instead. But I didn't change any of the other rules about ogres
Yeah.
in here. It's just matching up the hit dice so that it's a smooth transition.
And
So
Tag says, if you guys are excited about this, come do a play by post game with us. Um,
yes,
you guys have no idea how much stuff the bros constantly have going on. I can't. My whole channel was an attempt to keep up with it, and I cannot. There are awesome people doing amazing gaming things left and right. So I would recommend you follow. Again, I'm not sure what Tag's handle is on Twitter. But
so he's
follow.
not on Twitter anymore, but
Oh, he's
hit
not.
me up
Okay.
and we can get you in there.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's Captain Hook, and we're playing with R
That's right.
Dubs and all those. So just tag any of us, and we'll get you into the
Yeah,
Discord.
Captain Hook. That's the other one I was thinking of with you and R
Yeah,
Dubs and Steven, the Purple Druid. So yeah, and if you guys are all if you're not already, you can follow me. I'm at Dundermoose on Twitter, and I'll plug you in with these guys so you can have your first authentic real game of chainmail. How
yes,
awesome is that? All right,
yes,
so we talked a little bit about chainmail and OD&D, and we talked a little bit about the Old Lords. Uh, let's bring it forward to today because you do have a new product that just launched a couple days ago
yes.
called HellMarch.
Yes, so HellMarch is um, it's it's everything I wanted chainmail to be for like the modern audience. Right.
Okay.
So I'm reading through chainmail and I'm making the Old Lords, and there's that little bug in my brain that's like, fix it up, fix the mechanics, like make them correct, make them modern,
Yeah, yeah.
with everything that we've learned. And like, no, I can't do that. This is going to be like the authentic thing. I don't want to do what what like Osric did, where we're just going to start changing up the stuff we don't understand. It's like, no, whatever was missing in there, or like wherever chainmail was vague, I'm making it vague too, because that was important to it. Like
Yeah.
chainmail, when you play chainmail, you realize it's actually a lot like playing D&D, where you get to those vague spots in the rules, and then what do? Playing a game of chainmail is exactly like that when you're playing D&D. It's wild. You wouldn't expect that from reading the rules. You're like, oh, that's a lot of rules. Surely it's complete. No, it's got the same kind of gaps in it that OD&D does, or that every edition of D&D does.
So
It's
what happened? What do you have an example of like a time when you guys were playing and something wild came up and you're like, we're off the map here. What do we do in this?
Just okay. So like it just comes up every time. Just a unit of light horsemen are charging, and we've got some archers that are like they're going to get hit first, and behind them we've got some footmen, and yeah, this cavalry charge, and behind them we've got some armored foot, and on one side we're over here thinking that, well, we're going to be able to pull our archers back because there's a rule for being able to draw back, to draw back from a charge, and you get to go back 3 inches through some melee, so it kind of like screens the charge for you. And
yeah, they can draw back without breaking or failing morale, right? Like they just like they kite a bit.
Right, it's organized, but we hadn't intermixed the slings with the footmen, so they weren't actually organized to be able to do that. And
well, and light horse, are those cavalry in the sense that they can do charges, or is that just
yes,
like foot that
they
is
can do
mobile?
charges. They can do charges, and then it gets more complicated because it's not entirely clear what melee range is in chainmail,
Okay.
which is quite the omission.
Yeah.
In man-to-man, it says that it's 3 inches. In mass combat, it never defines it, but it says that there's a 1-inch range of control for the purpose of intercepting. So is that melee range? That doesn't seem to be melee range either, because you were very specific about it. So do they have to be touching to be in melee?
Does it say anything about base-to-base contact, or is that not?
It doesn't say.
Huh.
Like it's a crazy omission. And so then what happens if you charge, but the charge ends within 1 inch, but doesn't quite touch them? And what if you've got other units within 3 inches? Because it does list that within 3 inches you can draw in. So your buddies will like pack in around you to join in the melee.
On. Yeah.
So can they draw in if the charge almost got there, but it was an incorrectly called charge, so it didn't actually make base-to-base contact? Right?
Ardub says, "Stop talking about my charges, bro.
You didn't make it." Wow. And so there's so many little gaps in the rules where if that was a D&D game, that would be easy to say, well, yeah, the DM decides that part. It would be obvious that the DM decides that part. But when you're talking about wargamers like they want a solid answer to that. They don't want that to be where the fuzzy part is.
Yeah, I had Rob Kuntz on this show. I wish he was here right now to tell us what the what was it called, the LGTSA?
Oh, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, what that group was using.
No, there is kind of a rule 0 in chainmail, right? Is chainmail the one where it says if you have to house rule it, just write it down in the rule book and then abide by that from now on? Is that chainmail or is that OD&D?
Pretty sure that's in the intro to chainmail.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, and that's like the first instance of that, and that's explaining it to you. And then you see very similar language in OD&D, where it's like, amend this book with any additional rules, and that's because you're going to add stuff to it.
Bounce Cleveland says,
yeah,
hey, it's not a true war game unless arguments over the rules break out.
Yeah.
That's exactly. I got there. No, you were an inch away.
Yeah. So yes. So I kept the old lords very authentic.
You kept old lords authentic. You were like, this is going to be the true recreation, the spiritual, accurate. So was that kind of freeing when you turned to HellMarch? You're like, I already have my accurate homage. Now I can play a little bit.
Right. And okay. So it's like, so I learned so much from chainmail from from the rules that were in there, from the rules that weren't, and all of that. And so given all of that information and the time that I've spent playing Chainmail and play testing my variations of it since then, eventually I got like these. This is just a common pattern. Anyone can use it. It's very simple. It's different than Chainmail, where you really need to go back and reference the tables all the time.
Yeah.
Because this is reduced to some very specific patterns where you can play it once using the rulebook, and you'll probably just have it memorized that early on.
Right on. And there's various places in here where you reference, okay, if you're going to do it like this, just use the rules that are already in ShadowDark that you already know, right?
Exactly. And so we can talk about that because this actually relates to how Chainmail fit with OD&D. Because in Chainmail, there was a rule system for mass combat. There was a rule system for man-to-man combat. And then there was the rule system for fantastic combat. And once you bring OD&D into the mix and you want to use the D20 combat system that's in OD&D, then that's replacing the fantastic combat.
Yeah.
But even the D20 combat system that's introduced in OD&D plays well with the mass combat that's in Chainmail. Like you can use both of them in the same situation. So you get
and that's
kind of
what first edition does, right? Is they just kind of scale up the D20 system.
Right. So yeah, once you get to first edition, all you have is a later evolution of the fantastic combat.
Yeah.
And you notice that the weapon and armor thing is in there too, and that was turned into a table of modifiers.
Okay.
Right. So
R-Dubs looks like he disagrees.
Yeah.
Let's argue about some rules again, guys. I need to get R-Dubs on. R-Dubs, remind me to have you on, and you can have your say on this, bro.
Yeah.
He's probably just salty you didn't let him charge.
So first edition kind of combines the man-to-man and the fantastic combat, but it still doesn't include the mass combat.
Okay.
And there's other things you can do there instead. Like you can use 20-to-1 figures, and there are rules for morale. Like there's a lot of rules in first edition, but there's not rules for the same kind of mass combat that's in Chainmail.
All right, I think he said yes now. I think he said no to what I was saying and yes to what you were saying, so that tracks.
Excellent. Back me up, R-Dubs. So, because what you want to do as a player is you're gonna hire 10 mercenaries, and you're gonna bring them with you while you're traveling to guard your wagons, because you're about to bring back a whole load of gold from the dungeon because you're optimistic. And so you've got 10 mercenaries, and you're going along, and you run into 30 goblins, which is the smallest number of goblins you can run into in the wild, by the way.
Yeah, the overland is insane.
Yeah, 30 to 300, and we can talk about those numbers. It lines up exactly with so much stuff. So then you've got a couple of heroes in your party, you've got 10 mercenaries, and you've got 30 goblins. Now, you don't want to be tracking the HP of 30 goblins.
Right.
Right? And maybe the 10 mercenary you hired are like medium cavalry. Like they've got some decent art. Like they're wearing chainmail, and they've got axes. They're pretty intimidating. So you might actually consider just having them charge the goblins and scaring away the goblins, and there's not even a fight.
Yeah.
And that's something. Yeah, and that's something that's in Chainmail, and maybe there's something about that in AD&D. I don't know, but about that specific thing. But in Chainmail, there's specifically a rule for a morale check when you're charged by cavalry, because it's really scary.
Yeah.
And so you're thinking about the men that you've hired as a military unit with rules that enforce that. And you're not reusing the same kind of morale check that you would use for skirmish combat, open order combat, which is basically everything that you do in D&D.
Okay.
So another thing that wargamers would know is that when you've got elite troops, they can operate in open order, but The troops that are in closed order are your masses of troops. So you've got one sergeant for each of them, and they need that sergeant because the men don't know what to do. They just know how to take orders from the sergeant. But when you've got these open order troops, each one of them is individually trained. They can operate without like that central note.
They're not just going to throw their weapons down and run if they don't have someone telling them exactly where to go.
Right, and so there's those differences whenever you're thinking about things more as mass combat. And we just have this assumption that everything's skirmish combat in D&D now. So there's all those things that you lose whenever you just say, we're going to play AD&D, and we're going to use 1 to 20 scaling, and then we're going to use the same skirmish rules that we use for open skirmish.
Hard says, like me with Jeffro, I don't know what to do now that he's a dance blogger. Your sergeant has gone open floor formation. I don't know any dance terms.
So
I'm sorry, I distracted you.
No, I'm sorry. I'm trying to organize my thoughts as well. Because the LGTSA, that's the acronym you were looking for, maybe?
Yes. Not to be confused with similar sounding acronyms.
Yeah, this is the Lake Geneva Tactical Studies Association. I've got it here in my notes.
Right.
So having mass combat available to you, along with the normal D&D rules that you're used to, opens new avenues for play. You think about things differently, and the way that we were talking about, like how the catapult, what the mechanics asks of you puts you more in the role of the game, then the same things happen when you have mass combat. It's like, okay, now I'm not thinking about this as a slugfest where one side's going to be entirely dead at the end of this. This is going to be a battle between units where there's only going to be 1 or 2 rounds of melee before one of them runs away, most likely. And that's it. And now you're thinking about it like mass combat. And AD&D does have the thing where, if you kill their leader, then they all have to check morale, right?
Yeah.
So you get these traces of chainmail in there, but it's not the full mass combat thing. And the mass combat rules don't have to be crazy complicated, and that's what HellMarch is trying to show. So what HellMarch is just those mass combat rules, and it's made to be added into ShadowDark.
Yeah. And ShadowDark doesn't have any yet. This is the first time ShadowDark has mass combat rules, yeah?
Right. There might be other supplements. I don't think that any of them are based on chainmail. I don't think that any of them have.
And they would all also be third party, right? Like it's not part of the came with game.
Right. So yeah, none of the others are based on chainmail that I'm aware, and definitely not this closely associated with chainmail, because these are the mechanics of chainmail that are in here. And there's this idea that there's the mass combat, the units that are on the field at the same time as the characters. I can provide the mass combat. The fantastic combat is already provided by chainmail, because that's all that fantasy RPGs provide now. And so this will play along perfectly fine with both of them. You have levels. Levels are hit dice from chainmail.
Yeah, I always had a hard time wrapping my head around what hit dice represented. Like when I first started playing 5e, I was like, why do they have hit points and hit dice?
Right.
But like if you understand the lineage of it, it makes a lot more sense.
Right. And part of it is about the resolution of the scenes that you're playing. And by that I mean like the granularity of it, like how closely are we tracking certain things. So if you've got 50 figures on the battlefield, 50 characters in combat, because you've got 30 goblins, you've got 10 men, you've got everyone in your party, and they're all going to fight now. You don't want to take 30 turns for the bad guys, 10 turns for all your mercenaries, and then you've got to see if Bob's still paying attention, because he needs to take his turn, and he hasn't picked his spells yet. So
he's looking up the perfect meme on his phone.
Yeah. Right. So Bob misses his turn. And so with mass combat, those 30 goblins are acting like one unit. So you resolve them as just one character in this fight. They're just one
Yeah. Each
part of
goblin
it.
becomes a hit point, if you will.
Yeah, and so hit dice are basically 1 hit dice per character attacking. So if there's 30 goblins, you roll 30 d6, and
Which sounds
you
like a ton of fun.
it does. And if you don't have enough dice, you can roll 10 and count each one as 3 goblins. Like,
Yeah.
that's perfectly fine to do. You don't want to reduce it down to like rolling 3 dice and each one of those is 10. That's a little too swingy. And I talk about that in here. But each hit dice is actually that person's chance to hit the enemy. And we're not tracking hit points in here. So a hit is actually a casualty. So you're going to roll 30 hit dice, and it's going to hit on 5s and 6s, and you're going to count those up, and that's how many of the other guys you killed.
Nice.
And that's the entire turn for those 30 goblins. And then your 10 guys are going to do that too, and they're going to get some kills. And then you're going to compare the kill counts. And then you go to...
Where's the part? Oh, here's where you talk about the casualties. Not all casualties are fatalities, right?
Right. And so we're just counting hits while we're playing. We don't need to know what their HP are. Some of them are dead, some of them aren't, but they're out of the battle.
Yeah.
That's what matters in the middle of the battle. Is you've downed, you killed 10 of their guys, you hit 10 of their guys. They're out. Just pluck those figures off the board or knock them down or whatever. You're playing theater of the mind, that's fine. You killed 10 guys, move on.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to read the casualty part because I love how that sets up more story as well. Right. So it says casualties are not all fatalities. Half of casualties are merely wounded and may be restored to health given appropriate supply and facility. The loser's casualties are left on the battlefield. Those may be slain, taken prisoner, or perhaps even hired or pressed into service if alignment permits. So like the impact of who ran and who stood and fought. Now you've got another problem. If you're just trying to be get along gang, get the ruby, like now you got a problem. You got 10 goblin captives. Most of them can't walk because they're injured, and you got to decide what to do with them. If you could, hold them for ransom and get money, or if you should just kill them, or what, that's gameable.
It is, and maybe the chaotic thief in your party is like, no, wait, they're my alignment. You want to work with me now?
Yeah.
And now you're
thank goodness
thieves.
you're here.
Yeah. And now your thief's getting in on the mass combat game too, and he's got 8 little goblin buddies that are happy to be alive.
Yeah, are you guys passing notes? No. Where's my wallet? Good job, little guy.
And yeah, like there's so many ways. If you consider that it's the mass combat is happening at the same time as normal combat.
Yeah.
Like they're not separate things. Like, well, I wanted to set up a big battle, or I wanted to... don't set up battles. Just play the game. And now, when those big scenarios happen, then you can do that. Or now, whenever the dragon shows up outside the starter town, what are you going to do? You're going to go rally some people from town, and you might get some help from the villagers. And now you have rules to do that. And so the players...
going to be quick and elegant, and it's going to make sense.
It's going to make sense. And in the player's mind, they're no longer thinking, oh, well, having 20 people, like 20 more NPCs in combat is going to just slow this down so much. And so the player is then avoiding the correct role-playing thing to do.
Yeah.
And
they're not acting along how their character would act. They're not in the moment. They're not role-playing. They're metagaming.
Right. And
interesting.
And having just some simple mass combat rules lets you handle all those different situations. And those situations come up a lot in fantasy scenarios. Like, people talk about Lord of the Rings all the time, and all the best scenes in Lord of the Rings are mass combats.
Yes, Helm's Deep.
Yeah, and you have these characters, and the heroes look so cool whenever they're killing a goblin every time they swing their sword.
Yeah.
And if you're playing OD&D with Chainmail, you could do that. That's what it is. So the hero characters, when they have 4 hit dice, I've already told you what hit dice do. The level 4 person, the level 4 fighter has 4 hit dice. That means when he's in mass combat, he's rolling to kill 4 dudes. That's the magic of it. And And that magic works completely in ShadowDark. What do we have here?
Bradford Walker says, couple all of this with things bros have brought out of the memory hole and pieced together from the parts boomers left lying around, and you have something better than video and conventional play. Because that's if you read Bradford Walker's blog, he talks about how like a lot of what conventional play has become in role-playing games is done easier and better by video games. You can have the same experience and you don't have to wait for everyone's schedules and conflicts, right? So, I like this. I'm intrigued by what I see on the cover here.
Yes.
Volume 1. I couldn't help but notice. Sounds like you might have more things up your sleeve for later.
Yes. So I have all sorts of ideas for like I love game design, and so I'm always like I've always got multiple things cooking, right? And that holds up me publishing stuff and getting stuff done. So I had these mass combat rules written up like 4 months ago, 4 or 5 months ago, almost completely what was published here, and it's like, well, there's more things I want to make so I can release an entire product, but that's like my perfectionism, never going to publish anything.
Yep.
It's like, okay, look, this is done. I can release this as is. People need this right now in their games. It functions perfectly. This is marketed for ShadowDark because it's the super popular OSR game. Like you're either playing Axe or you're playing ShadowDark, right? Opposite end of the spectrum. If you want crunch, you already have mass combat in Axe. But if you're playing ShadowDark, you don't have this.
Shucked Oyster came out from Black Lodge Games as a supplement for ShadowDark, and I think the cool thing about ShadowDark is it's quick and easy, and a lot of people really seem to enjoy it. And it doesn't have its own setting. It doesn't have a lot of the parts where you're like, okay, after my deep dive into the past, as far as like what's awesome about these things, you can bring them and plug them into this modern sports car chassis and say, all right, let's streamline this and put it together and see how it works together.
Yeah, and so I market this for ShadowDark. Now, to ShadowDark's credit, these rules work exactly the same with OD&D.
Okay.
ShadowDark is that close to OD&D in terms of what rules are in ShadowDark.
Okay.
That these rules, like the HellMarch rules, were what I designed whenever I was just refining Chainmail. And I'm looking at ShadowDark saying, okay, how do I make this for ShadowDark? Oh, I don't have to change anything.
Wow.
ShadowDark's average hit dice for rolling HP for characters is a D6. And that's what lines it up. And their average damage from weapons is a D6. So that's all that it took to make OD&D compatible with Chainmail. Then that's all it takes to make it compatible with ShadowDark. It's compatible out of the dark. R-dubs, I do not believe that they have mercenaries, but Volume 2 might.
Ooh.
Volume 2 might.
There was a question earlier about does ShadowDark have hirelings?
Yes, hirelings. I don't believe that they have hirelings. I might be wrong about that, honestly. But
somebody had mentioned that there was another third-party one that... Oh, here it is. Pounce Cleveland says, there's a supplement called Friends in Dark Places by Jordan Rudd for hirelings.
Well.
So thinking about what does it do to a player, especially... Now, the thing that people say about ShadowDark, and I don't know if it's true or not, but they say that it like just does one thing really well, and that is the dungeon crawl. The dungeon crawl experience. What does the option for mass combat do in the mind of a player if they know that's on the table? How does it change by adding it and making it a possibility?
You can now deal with larger groups of enemies. And that comes up because you want to go get the treasure out of the goblin cave, or whatever. And there's not just a couple of goblins.
That's right.
There's going to be a whole lot of them. And sometimes you just want to pay a whole lot of people and storm the cave and be done with that. Or you want to trick them and draw the goblins out and ambush them. Like, you want to do stuff, and mass combat comes up a lot.
Yeah.
Like, the opportunity for mass combat comes up a lot. And it was the assumption in OD&D. And in ShadowDark, the encounter tables don't have mass combat. Like, it doesn't create those scenarios most of the time. It'll be like, oh, well, there's 3 goblins show up, or there's 2d6 goblins show up, and so you cap out at 12 there. That's not really a huge mass combat.
Yeah.
You can still use the HellMarch rules for them and make that very quick. Something else that that mass combat will do, even if you're talking about maybe just a dozen people on each side, that's still an opportunity to use mass combat rules, because you still don't need to be tracking everyone's HP.
Yeah.
Right. It's a chance to say, hey, there's a mass combat over there. I'm sure we can take it, but we don't have another hour to play it, so we're not going to do it. But with mass combat, that's going to be one round, and it's going to work or not, and we're going to move on. And that's going to take 10 minutes. Now you're going to consider that mass combat instead of it being off the table.
Yeah.
And
yeah, because if it's going to take over an hour, people are like, oh, well, we wanted to do something else with our night. Right. But if you're like, hey, we can do this, no problem. Tag says, we are the main cast of the TV show. Syndrome dictates every combat is a reasonable number of enemies. That's pretty limiting. And then Bradford Walker follows up with, for the weebs, mass combat means you can play fantasies like Grand Crest, Arslan, Lodos, Overlord, etc., where mass combat is a feature of the story. I don't know what most of those things are, but I know what Lodos is.
You left Berserk out of there.
Well, I was thinking
there's
of
a lot of mass combat in there too.
I was thinking of Goblin Slayer. Like, that one starts off as a kind of a delving, but on the final episode, when they realize that a massive army of goblins has mobilized and they're trying to defend their town, they have to get all the adventurers together and they have to do a mass combat at the end of that series. Spoiler alert. Sorry if you guys haven't seen it. I think psychologically, knowing that mass combat is on the table can make your players more rooted to a spot. If they know that if they're just passing through and the town is where they're going to buy their stuff before they go on their next delve, that's one thing. But if they're like, this is my home, and you say there's an army of orcs amassing over the horizon, and what are you going to do in the time that you have to keep this place from being overrun and burned to the ground? Because they're going to try and knock down the walls and kill everyone and burn the city. Or you can have that part of your character's backstory. We're old nobility that doesn't have any money anymore, and I need you to go out to the borderlands, become somebody, raise a force, and get our name back in the lists of the noble houses. Something like that.
Yeah, I mean, and what else does it change when they're in town, when they meet people? Now it's like, hey, do you want to join I'm building a little mercenary group right now, and you're not the asshole of the party for doing that, knowing that now every single combat's going to go slower.
Yeah,
it's like the fighter in here can have 40. Like, he can command 40 men per level.
Right on.
Which aligns with AD&D's growth. Like, I think it's 160 men at 4th level, and that goes up to 360 once they're lords at name level. And so those numbers match up with AD&D. And
it makes sense too in AD&D why the henchmen and the hirelings will not go below level 3 of a dungeon. Because it's like, you can't just get an army and then just steamroll the dungeon and get all the loot, right? Like, these guys are like, we like fighting where we can see the sun and breathe the air. We're not going down there. It's only crazy adventurer people do that. And then,
so, and it's no place for them. There's much more limited opportunities for mass combat deep underground. Like, it's possible, but it's not so common because you're in such cramped places.
Yeah. Like, that even if, like, your bows and arrows won't shoot as far, right? Because they would have to arc up and hit the ceiling and all that stuff. all that stuff.
So
Okay.
So yeah, in HellMarch, if we scroll down a bit to just like the index here, I've got a couple of different modes here. I've got indoor combat and outdoor combat. So indoor combat is whenever you're in those tighter spaces and you have a handful of men, you're probably in open order because you can't hold a big formation whenever you're underground in a dungeon. Or even if you're in like urban streets, you don't have big army formations there. That they have to fight in open order combat. It's all a lot looser. And once it's a lot looser, it doesn't matter exactly where those pieces are positioned. So it's not like you have to play this like a grid game.
Yeah.
It's like your 10 men are in this room, and that's all you really need to know. And so it's completely conducive with theater of the mind play, or whenever you have very abstract play on the map. And the indoor combat, you can get a lot of mileage out of just those rules and memorize them, and you don't have to go super crunchy the way that Chainmail and the Old Lords does.
Okay.
And once you do get outdoors, where you're going to have formed groups of men and like close formation and stuff like rotating your army because there's an ambush coming from the side of the road, well, you can't do that. That takes an entire turn. Like, and that's something you have to consider if you have mass combat rules. But that's not, but not if you're just playing by the skirmish rules that are meant for players.
Yeah.
Not for all of the men too.
Where you're not like doing like fife and drum orders to get them to go from a column to a line or whatever.
Exactly. So so whenever you're dealing with those outdoor situations, there's outdoor combat. It's got more of that crunch. It's still not like the super heavy stuff. If you really want that, you can upgrade and like patch in parts from Chainmail if you like want to go that far. But I think I hit just the right amount of crunch for even what you want to have at the table when it's like, well, the guy who likes their crunch, I think will enjoy using the outdoor combat without just taking over the entire game session just because they're like, hey, let's use the outdoor combat rules. They're like, why would you invoke that? No, it's really not that bad. And it's just a little bit extra. Like you don't really have to worry about ranges if you're underground. Anything that you can see, you can hit with a bow. And you're probably not going to hit things indirectly. So those indirect rules are in the outdoor combat, and you don't have to worry about it if you're indoors.
You don't need to worry about that indoors.
So
I'm trying to keep up with the chat here. It's getting pretty crazy. Tag says, I always thought it was pretty obvious you can't bring 35 heavy foot into the dungeon and use them as meat shields, but people keep bringing up that stupid argument. Crafty Matt says, I just want to play Conan. Great. Get ready to lead entire armies of men and mercenaries. Yeah, I'm reading the Scarlet Citadel right now, and Conan starts off by leading 5,000 cavalry in the beginning of that short story. So,
yeah.
Tag says, marching is a skill. Go watch kids in boot camp or first year marching band nerds. Formations are no joke.
And the formations, or like those scenes where you've got your hero with the men and they're fighting, right? And so they charge out with them. And those are such cinematic moments in movies.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And that same thing doesn't exist in RPGs.
Yeah, you got to get the eve of war speech, right? Where you're like riding along in front of your men and you're like holding your sword out to hit all their spears and but
that does exist in Chainmail, and that doesn't exist in HellMarch now.
Right on.
So if you're with your men and you charge, then you're adding all of your hit dice to all of your men's hit dice, and you're just slaying everybody, and that's really cool. And then whenever you're leading your men and there's the 30 goblins and the goblin boss, and he's kind of like the leader of the other side, and he's got multiple hit dice as well, right? So you've got your big monster versus the hero. You want to focus on them dueling it out.
Yeah, wading towards each other across the field.
Exactly. And there's rules for that in Chainmail. That troops prioritize fighting other troops.
Mm-hmm.
So your troops are going to fight each other,
Yeah, they're
and then
not
you're
going to
going to
want to
go
go
fight.
up against the Spartan guy, right?
Yeah, and you're going to go for the other boss and fight him instead. And so now you've got the cinematic thing where you're having a typical RPG combat, which is like really high resolution. You want to know how much HP they have because that's part of the anticipation of it, you know.
Yeah.
Um, and you care about the goblin boss's HP, and then you're rolling for these huge groups of troops fighting around you. Yeah.
Josh and Eustace, what we do in chainmail echoes in eternity. Right on.
Um, and yeah, so it makes those cinematic moments, and there's always been rules for that, and we've just ignored them entirely.
Yeah.
But all of that's brought back in here.
I love that you have an army building section, and I really love that you have an example of play just to kind of walk people through. This is what this looks like. This is how it works.
And I've got that goblin fight example in there showing, here's the men fighting the goblins, and you hit them with a wave of arrows at first, and you're fighting, and you're outnumbered, but you're also you got to charge them, and that's like really good. That's a really good bonus.
Yeah.
Mass combat is very much about, can you get the maneuver off first? It's about positioning and morale a lot more than it is about HP. So we don't care to track individual HP. Like whoever has the initiative, whoever has the engagement, has a lot of power. And I actually invented a new kind of initiative in here,
Cool.
which draws from two different sources. There's a game called Crossfire, which just has a wild initiative system. It's for World War II,
Okay.
but it's one player has the initiative, and they act until they get interrupted by the other player, and it makes you think about the game entirely differently. Because like, what actions do you want to do? Because you want to do powerful stuff, but you don't want to risk getting interrupted. Because then you'll yield it, and now the other person will have the stage. Now that's like really swingy, so I don't have that in here, but inspired by that, we've got like the taking turns back and forth, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's one side
You
goes,
go,
the
I
other
go.
side goes, and whoever's going first has initiative, right? So if you have initiative, you decide who goes first. Maybe you want to stay back and see what the enemy does because you know that you're going to be able to charge them if
Yeah.
they take a step forward. So if you have initiative, you have more control that turn of combat. If the underdog manages to break your morale in any of the fights during that round, then they gain the initiative.
Oh, okay, cool.
Right? So maybe you do something because you have initiative, and then and maybe you set up for a fight and you go fight them, and the underdog fights you and breaks morale in just one of those. Not only did he just move and get his turn, now he gets to go again.
The cowards are running at them, boys.
Yeah, and so he gets to go again immediately after because he's taken the initiative.
That's awesome.
And that can only happen once. Like once you have initiative, you can't do that again. So it can go back and forth. So what this actually is like old school essentials where each player rolls a d6 at the beginning of the turn, so you see who goes first that turn.
Mm-hmm.
Same sort of thing happening. Sometimes you'll get a double move.
Right on.
But now I've tied it to, if you can break the enemy morale, then you get it. So now you've got to do something for it, and you have more control over it. So
cool.
So that adds more strategy there. Yeah.
So would you, in creating this, are you hoping to bring more war gamers to ShadowDark, or are you hoping to expand ShadowDark players' mode of play to include more wargaming aspects, or both?
I mean, the answer is both. I think it's more for the latter though.
Okay.
Because RPG players are not used to mass combat.
Yeah.
And this really is made for them, where it's like start including some mass combat in here. Here's how you do it. These are rules very similar to what you're used to, that you can pick up and use, and you can start adding some mass combat to what you're doing right now. Even playing Theater of the Mind, you can
Yeah.
have some mass combat elements in there, and and it'll give you that opportunity to start thinking about movement and morale instead of HP.
Arnman asks, what are other party members doing during mass combat? Thief, for example.
Yes. So first of all, in mass combat is not separate from the normal combat. Like if you're in an encounter and you're in turns, there's mass combat rules you can use. But if you're a wizard, you can still use your spells.
Yeah.
Right? That's still part of the thing. If you're a thief, you can still move around and backstab. You can do that.
Brian says the thief is laughing at them, suckers.
The thief is not as good at leading men. Right? He's not a fighter. The fighter's made for this. He's a sergeant. He's going to become a commander whenever he gains levels. Thief's not like that. So the thief can lead 10 men per level as opposed to the fighter's 40 men per level.
Yeah.
So he can still bring some men along. He can still do some stuff, but he wants to be sneakier about it. He doesn't want to stay for the long fight. He just wants to ambush someone so that he can get a flanking bonus and an impetus bonus and just get some like crazy one awesome round of combat, and then he wants to disappear again. Or he just wants to only take those fights where he can win that in one round and be done with it.
Or he just wants to take his men and skirt around the fight and get to the baggage train behind.
And then he's got 10 men hauling his loot back while no one's noticed. Yeah. The thief
good
is
question,
doing something else. Yeah, very, very good.
Cellstock says the thief is looting the bodies.
Yeah. Maybe half the casualties are not alive at the end of combat.
Oh man, we set Tag off talking about the baggage train. He said, "No, we don't talk about baggage. Ignore that. D&D isn't a war game." Shh.
Yeah,
sounds like there might be some history behind that one.
Baggage is interesting. It's one more thing where baggage was listed as an optional rule in chainmail.
Yeah.
And baggage is those supplies that you always bring along in combat. You don't bring them onto the battlefield, but if the enemy sees your baggage, they're going to charge it because that's their chance to loot and get out of there.
Yeah, because they, in the back of their mind, they just want to survive and get back home and before the seasons change, so they can help bring in the crops, right? So if they see the baggage, is it like a morale check if they see it, or is it just like no? If they see it, they're gone.
They see it, they're gone. If they can get to it, I think if there's no one in the way, then they'll just run for it. And it's an optional rule in chainmail. But then when you go into OD&D Book 3, in the naval rules, and you won't recognize it if you haven't read chainmail. But in the naval rules in OD&D Book 3, whenever you board a ship, if your men go below decks and you don't have a lieutenant watching them, your men will just start plundering. They'll ignore your commands. They'll just start plundering.
Everyone's a thief when the sergeant looks away, right?
And it's like there's that optional baggage rule that was in chainmail, and now it's part of OD&D, and it's made even more specific. It's hilarious. And it's another thing that you want to think about as a commander boarding ships. It's like now your pirate player is going to be that much like more on point.
Yeah.
And
Tag says if the men are on a march, they have potentially months of pay in a chest chilling on a wagon. That is quite enticing.
Yeah. So baggage makes it more exciting. If we go to page 7 again, the victory and defeat section. So I describe in here like a couple of ideas for how to structure a mass combat, but just the first two paragraphs there are the terms of victory and defeat are best when tailored to the game scenarios you're already playing, right? This isn't a war game the way that like you sit down to play Warhammer 40k and you've got some victory point conditions and some control points. It's not calculated that way. What you're concerned about in mass combat in an RPG is about the long game.
Yeah.
So
it's not turn 5 is over and my guy is still next to the thing. I win.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, oh, there's
And
always going to be a turn 6 where they come in and stomp you.
or if you've got some kind of army where you take heavy casualties, but then you win.
Yeah.
Right. But here those casualties really matter because you need to take them out of that combat. If you lose all your men, how much of a victory was that?
Yeah.
And that matters. And that context is already in RPGs. Like that makes this a cooler war game than just a war game. And the RPG's already set up for that. Like don't design a separate mass combat. Just add this to your existing combats. And you can tailor the combat like this happens. You can say like, here's a spot you can try to control. As like an additional victory condition. But what are they saying?
Sorry, I'm cracking up here. Mac Oppie says, if I bought the PDF from drive-through before the stream ends, can I start my next battle with an extra hero token? Doug says you have to buy it twice to get the bonus.
Yeah.
Oh man, you guys crack me up.
So you asked me a question. I didn't answer it entirely. This is volume 1.
Yes.
There will be more volumes. This is the mass combat from Chainmail, and like set up so that you can start using it immediately in ShadowDark. And since ShadowDark is like this distillation of RPGs, like this common core, really, then you can put this mass combat directly on it and use it with the existing RPG combat. And so you can just start using that right away. In volume 2 and 3, I want to get into like, here's some like pre-made armies for you and how to think about armies that you can include. Like, here's who's underground, or here's who your enemy is outside of town, or what does your town's military look like, depending on how big they are. So I want to have something like that for like war bands that you can just throw into your game. And about war campaigns, like an alternate way to play ShadowDark. Like maybe instead of rolling up characters to start the game, maybe you get 100 points and you get to build an army to start the game, right?
Right on.
Now, wouldn't that be cool? And what if you got to start the game with a small mercenary company? Like maybe you got 200 points and there's a hero in there. And then you say, now that hero's the commander and you don't get to play as him. You get to play with one of the little guys and you report to the commander. And so now you start developing like the individuals that are in there. So you have this company of characters that are all gaining levels, right? And
dude, you know what I'm thinking of right now? I don't mean to interrupt you, but one of the things that has made ShadowDark such a success is that it's very good for a con game. Like, you set up a scenario and then, get people to sign up, and then you can run run it at a convention. How awesome would a war game scenario be for that, where you just come in and say, all right, I know you guys want to play ShadowDark, but you each get 100 points, and start them off that way,
Yeah, well, that's still really cool, because maybe they wanted to play a wizard. Now they can say, like, I want a level 8 wizard, and you spent the points on that, and here's how many other men they can bring along, and they've got an escort to go with them. And that's pretty cool. And that's even better.
How Frostgrave started.
Yeah.
And about that.
And it's useful for characters, like even wizards, to have their own escort with them, because if they get mobbed, like all those people mobbing them have to get through their troops first. The wizard only has to care about like the other bosses, like the other main monsters. And so having the mass combat increases the survivability of characters and heroes, which feels backwards from what you normally see. Like if you're playing them all individually, there's no rule like that says that the enemy troops can't attack you directly, that they have to attack your troops first.
Yeah.
But it's encoded in there, and it's not me trying to be easy on modern players. Like, oh, they won't touch your special character until they get through the troops first. That was in Chainmail. That preceded D&D. That kind of heroic combat. And yeah.
So we got another question from Arnman. If I have chainmail, what would I gain by purchasing HellMarch?
You'll be able to convince your friends to play it.
That's one of the things Jeffro always says about John Mollison and Mr. Wargaming is, the wargamers are always just doing solo games because they can't get an opponent.
Yeah,
But I would, in defense of that, I would say there's a big market for solo RPGs too. So it may not
there
just be
are.
wargamers. Ironman goes on to say, I would rather see a demo of the game live, two well-heeled persons playing and explaining the fight and rules. And Ironman, you might get some of that in the the example of play from the book. But I don't know, would you be up for that if somebody if some actual player was like, hey, you want to run this and I'll get my theater nerd friends together? And
I'm not huge on actual plays, but like
not
for the
either.
purpose of a demo, and also I'm pretty sure we're going to be organizing some kind of play-by-post event anyway, and play some ShadowDark with HellMarch rules in there,
Cool.
and then that might be even better than just a demo scenario, because it'll be like, here are situations that came out of ShadowDark play where we engage HellMarch, and here's how it's done. Because dungeon masters, game masters, haven't had to think with mass combat on the table
Yeah.
for 50 years,
Yeah.
and
It's a
you
muscle
have,
that hasn't been exercised frequently.
and so you have to learn how to recognize those situations and opportunities, and
Hmm.
include them. And I try to show that a little bit in the example of play that's in there. But yes, I want to um, I want to teach and show people how to start including mass combat. And the next couple of volumes that I want to make are to aid in that further. In Chainmail and the Old Lords, there's factions, like existing factions, that
Yeah.
actually talk about the composition of the armies, which sounds like the nerdiest dumb thing until you're a game master that's like, hey, this town's mounting a defense. How many archers should I put out there?
Oh yeah.
Right?
I can't tell you how long I spent in Keep on the Borderlands, just doing an Excel spreadsheet of how many troops are in the keep, how many troops are in the Caves of Chaos. Like if they decided to
Uh-huh.
rally and march on them, and it's all in there.
It is all in there. And if you go to the Old Lords right now, I've got the whole section, page 14, the historical factions. And
Yeah.
just scroll in there, and those are the portions of your army that are Lightfoot, light horse, medium horse. It's got samurai in here for the Japanese,
Cool.
and it's got repeating crossbows for the Chinese. Like it's got some wild stuff in there, and now if you think about like OD&D in the context of chainmail, now whenever you roll up your fighter, now it's like, well, what faction are you?
Yeah.
What race are you?
What kind of
Because
fighter
it
are you?
matters. You're like, you hire some mercenaries, and they're all Mongols. Well, you've got your troop composition right there.
I love the hedgehog formation.
Yeah, it's super powerful.
And not everybody can do that, right?
It's just them. It's just them. I think one of the factions can do a weaker version of it that can't move around.
Yeah, okay. They just turtle up.
Yeah, I learned, so like, I'm not a war gamer. I am a role playing. I'm a TTRPG person.
Yeah.
So whenever I'm making these things, whenever I'm looking at war games, I'm thinking, how do I explain this to role players? Because I don't want to make
Yeah,
games that no one's going to play. I don't want to
that's
make
right.
something like HellMarch and be like, okay, I can sell this as a novelty that, as long as I make some money. I'm not interested in that.
Yeah,
If people aren't playing this, then I've failed.
right on.
And I want people to be able to play the mass combats. And I want them to learn how to start using these mass combats and make that a part of the role-playing game again, because it's going to make it even better. everyone wants those moments whenever they like, I'm going to be in
Yeah.
D&D. I'm going to be slaying the goblins and doing all this stuff. And now it's like, well, roll 1 attack because you're level 4 and you haven't got your extra attack bonus yet. Like, no,
Yeah, that's not what they want to talk to their friends about afterwards. They want to say, man, the valley was filling with drow, and
yeah,
it was up to us to stop them before they took everyone slave in our village, right?
yeah. They want those big epic combats, and
Mm-hmm.
they want it to be reasonable to get into one of those scenarios without it being a huge drag. And dungeon masters want to be able to um they want to be able to have like big enemies forces and not worry about overwhelming the players. You know,
Yeah,
if you've got mass combat, um, then that actually evens the battlefield more because now the players have a chance against uh, being rushed by 20 men. Like if you've got 20 men coming along, your party's all level 4. That's 16 hit dice
yeah,
of player characters, and so now 16 to 20. Okay, well that's still not in the player's favor. But if the players get the jump on them, then they get impetus, and
yeah,
that's rolling double the hit dice. So now your 4-player characters have overwhelmed 20 enemy men in 1 round of combat. All right,
yeah.
that's a completely different game
That
than
is.
what you've been playing.
It's pretty sweet. We've got another super chat. Thank you, William Moranto, $1.99. Thank you, Dunder. Love the channel. More B-dubs. I agree. There's never enough B-dubs. He's a hard guy to get a hold of. But if I have him on one more time, then he will take the lead. Right now, he's tied with Griff for who's been on This Is Dunder Moose the most.
Oh wow.
So thanks for the support, William. So while I got you thinking about role-playing games,
Yep.
let's take a break from the war game in here. I know we've only got a short time together before we got to move on here, but I saw you saying some interesting stuff about one-to-one time that I didn't see a lot of other people mentioning. So I'm wondering, like, your take on in session one-to-one time. Lay it on me.
Yes. Um, so whenever I started playing D&D, this is how I was introduced to it when we were playing 3.5 edition.
Mhm.
Is we were playing get along gang style. Like we weren't doing the PvP style. And my DM had not read the old AD&D books. He had no other context. He was introduced in 3rd edition. But it was obvious to us that whenever one player was trying to sneak around the back of a room where there's like enemies and the party's about to fight them, but one player is separating from the party to go do something else.
Yeah.
That player is not allowed to chime in while the rest of the party is fighting. Right? They're not there anymore. And that was obvious to us. And if there was a split in the party where it's like you don't know what's going on and it matters, we'd step out into the hallway of the dorm room
Like
and,
leave.
and the DM would like talk with them real quick and measure up what's going on and then call us back into the room because it mattered.
Yeah.
And because the because you don't know what the other people are doing. You don't know why they're missing. You don't know why they didn't get back yet. Were they caught by something? Are they just
Yeah.
like it takes a couple extra turns to get all that extra treasure they found? Like you don't know what it is, but now you've got to go figure it out. And if we were taking too long talking to each other in the middle of combat, the DM was like, "They can hear you. Like, are you just going to spend combat talking?"
So you were like in character while you were arguing at the table.
Right. And so it was just kind of obvious to us, like, yeah, we don't get all this time to think because our characters wouldn't either.
Yeah.
Right. And our characters are us, and we're not talking in funny voices or anything, but we can't be taking 15-minute turns here either.
Right.
You need to know what you're doing before your turn comes around. And I don't know if you skipped turns, but you got like heavy pressure if you were holding up for like trying to pick out a spell or something, right?
Yeah.
Like that was not just permitted. And I think he might have skipped turns. I didn't play a spellcaster at the time, so I didn't get any sore feelings about that. But he may have even done that, and that was just based on like obviously you can't take 15 minutes to make your turn, to take your turn. Like, you need to know what's going on. And you can strategize a little bit, but you don't have time to strategize a whole lot because your characters aren't actually next to each other able to talk.
Yeah.
So you just had to make a decision and move on. And when I was reading first edition AD&D, and I'm reading through it whenever I'm finally like clear mind, accept what's in here,
Yeah.
I am seeing stuff all over the book about time passing in the session matching the real time that passes while you're playing, right? So so it says explicitly, if your players are talking in the midst of combat, then the enemies can hear that discussion. Because if your players are strategizing about the combat, then that's implying that the characters are strategizing about the combat, about where they
Yeah.
need to move, or he's almost down or whatever. And so if you're like, okay, maybe the wizard's almost down, but maybe he'll get one more turn, and you say that out loud, now the goblins know.
It's like
Right?
it's like in Vietnam when they would like drop a magazine and they'd hear it hit the ground and then they'd start shooting because they knew you couldn't shoot back.
Yeah,
And then you got to where you would always carry an empty one to throw it so that they would think you were empty, and then when they popped out, you get them. So yeah, using auditory clues to keep the fight and the battle going. This
yeah.
sounds kind of like what the 4D guys do. And like I think there's a guy named Table Runner Crispy who's all about being in the moment like that and like putting people on the spot.
Mm-hmm.
Um
And
and the thing is, have you gotten any resistance from bringing this up? Because I feel like a lot of times when the bros talk about one-to-one time, they're referring to outside of session play. When no play is happening, it's one day to one day. And it seems like there's always people that misunderstand and say, "Oh, does that mean that if I have to go to the bathroom, then my character is going to the bathroom in the game?" So, disambiguate for us a little bit. Like, are you saying that one-to-one time always happens all the time in session 2, or are you saying there's moments where you dip into it and it becomes
what I'm saying, so the bros one-to-one time between sessions, I agree with it entirely. I
okay?
think that they are spot on with their interpretation of it. Um, in session play, I think the default is that time is passing one-to-one
Okay.
or very close. And so when ShadowDark says 1 hour of real time is a torch in the game, I think that is perfectly aligned with first edition.
Okay.
I think it is spot on, and it's
Perfect. Okay.
excellent. And that's what it's about. So a dungeon turn is 10 minutes, right?
Mhm. Yep.
And that's an approximation. And maybe it'll take about 10 minutes of real time for y'all to decide what you're doing in the room. It won't always. Maybe there's one and you just zoom through it, but then another you take longer. And so it's about 10 minutes. It's just an approximation. But while you're in that room and you're studying stuff, if it takes you 10 minutes of real time, then 10 minutes has passed in the game.
Okay.
And if you spend half an hour in that room, you haven't taken another dungeon turn or whatever, but you've spent 30 minutes in that room. That's how long you've taken in that room. So every 20 minutes you should be rolling for random monsters or whatever it is, right?
Mhm.
Like that's every 20 minutes of real time. If you're actually spending that time doing that, because that's what your characters have done.
Yeah.
If you're in this room not sure what to do as players for half an hour, your characters are stumped the same way.
Sorry, Brian just
Yeah.
said from now on every bio break, Pete the Pious is taking a dump in the dungeon. What are you feeding that character?
Um,
Oh man.
uh,
So
yeah,
the exception is when the DM comes in and says, "All right, we're going to jump forward in time because you guys are traveling or we're on a boat or whatever."
yeah. When you're traveling, or like if you're moving through the dungeon, retracing steps, then the DM is counting off time for that
Mhm.
behind the scenes. Like game time is skipping ahead, right? The way I put it though is that game time never pauses.
Okay.
or never significantly pauses. Like if we're taking a bio break and they're away, whatever. Okay, time's pause. We're not talking about that.
Mm-hmm.
But if the players are having to figure out something in the game and they're spending half an hour to do it, that's half an hour of actual game time.
Yeah.
And in combat, when he's saying when it takes the wizard 1 minute to pick out a spell, then skip their turn. It says that. If it takes the wizard
Yeah,
20
that's word
seconds,
for word. Yeah.
yeah, if it takes them 20 seconds to pick out a spell, then you're supposed to delay their actions by 20 seconds during that combat round. And that's a
Mm-hmm.
penalty for like whenever they're getting interrupted or whatever. Like that's the only part where it gets really complicated about turns and
Yeah,
segments and stuff,
segments.
right?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, is, segments are about that real time. If you're taking time in the midst of combat, is what it's talking about. It's where he gets into the most detail about it. Is that if your players aren't like spitting that spell immediately, then they're slower to cast it. That's one of the checks on the magical powers of wizards.
Yeah.
You know you can cast Wish, but if it took you 2 minutes to do it, the enemy's got 2 rounds of combat. You
Yeah.
know, and it's not just explained in combat. The limited Wish spell says it has the powers of Wish. You have 6 real life seconds to say your spell.
Which is awesome because if there's ever been a spell where people want to hem and haw, right?
Uh-huh. And that's literally what it is. 6 real seconds to phrase your wish. And that act of phrasing the wish is the vocals for casting that spell.
That's
And
awesome.
all throughout the player's handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide, these real-time elements are just expected in the game. And I don't think that's a mistake.
Yeah.
And I got the impression I did not play first edition AD&D enough, and I haven't played it in person to be able to test this. But the impression I get is that if you've got a fluent DM, you can play out combats because combats are 1 minute rounds.
Mm-hmm.
You can play that out in near real time. That is
Yeah.
that is what I believe.
Yeah.
Because of how adamant he is. And when you read the reports about people who said they played with him, they said he would skip your turn. And it was upsetting, but then immediately every single combat was so exciting and intense after
Yeah.
that. And he didn't feel bad about it afterwards. This guy was like, now I'm doing that in my home game. Like we're doing it everywhere. Everyone loves it. And it's the Bluey episode with the party game where you've got to unwrap it and is there a gift in every layer? No, not everyone's a winner here. But you're playing with the rules that sound
And
scarier,
Bluey
and
comes up
everyone
so
loves it.
much.
It is. There's so many good lessons in Bluey.
Yeah.
It's amazing. Pass the parcel. That's what that episode is.
So
Like,
whenever we come across one of those rules, my new base set is that this accomplished something, right? And that we ignore it at our peril and we won't
mm-hmm,
even know what we're missing if we don't try it. And I think one of the problems that one-to-one in session time solves is the thing we complain about, people either just hemming and hawing and not being in the moment or
mm-hmm,
being on their phone or whatever. Like if you're expected to be here on your turn ready, then once that expectation, after the hemming and hawing and the oh that's not fair, once you get to like okay this is how this goes, it kind of opens the door for you to mentally in your imagination be there while it's happening.
mm-hmm.
I don't want to say the word immersion because Brian's in the chat, but I will say engagement. That engagement of your intellect and your imagination to say, "Come here, be in this moment right now with us, and don't dip out, or your character will pay for it." Right?
So it's about the choices that you have to make as a player. And so if you have mass combat and you have a unit of men, you are now thinking about how to control that unit of men as a commander would control that unit of men,
Yeah.
right? And if you're in the moment in combat and you have to think about what you're going to do next in real time, you're thinking like your character, what do I need to do next in real time in the game, right? There's that overlap. And at every opportunity, Gary overlaps what the players and their characters are doing. Like, there's not going to be a fist fight at the table, but if there's a PvP going on, but as much as can be done, they overlap it, and that includes with time and the pressure of time, because nothing gets you like more into the game than understanding that the experience of the character and the player, they both have that same time deadline. If you've got an hour before your torch runs out in ShadowDark, you're rushing.
Yeah.
It's what you're doing.
Are you the one that got the little bowls of the orange D12s?
Yeah.
I loved that so much. I know we're almost out of time, but can you tell us about that a little bit real quick?
Oh man. So I was doing dungeon crawling in AD&D at that time. I was doing some of the solo play Appendix A stuff. Now I was testing that, and I think I was studying chainmail at the time, and I was thinking about how you could use D12s instead of D6s to get a little more granularity. And I was wondering about that, that a D12 based chainmail might be interesting. And so I was like, okay, I'll try getting some D12s. And D12s work very well as the random encounter rolls that you have to make. And if you have to make, if you have a 1 in 3 chance of an encounter every 20 minutes, then that's about the same ratio as a 1 in 12 chance of encounter every 10 minutes. So every 10 minutes is a dungeon turn. So if every 10 minutes I pluck a dice out of the dice bowl and roll it, then 10 minutes has gone by. I've had my 1 in 12 chance of an encounter. And I do that every 10 minutes, and the dice bowl empties out. And these are all like fire and
they're like orange sparks. And red. They look awesome.
Yeah, and so it's like a brazier. It's a little metal brazier I found on Etsy. So it's like the little fire pit, and you're plucking out the dice, and it's dwindling as you're down to your last couple of rolls. And it was just like really thematic. So you put that in the middle of the table. You're in a dungeon now, guys.
Yeah.
You light a torch. You get to put 6 dice in there.
I love it.
And you feel how minuscule that is.
Yeah.
Like, there's not many dice in there when you do that. You have to have a lamp, and that's like 3 hours of time, and then you get to like put 24 dice in there.
Yeah.
Awesome. And that feels a bit better. But yeah, the real time is underexplored in session. And this isn't about being an asshole to the players, right?
Yeah.
It's not about that. Everyone thinks about how inconvenient it is. You don't have to wait 10 minutes just because your characters, like you say, you want to go somewhere, and it takes 10 minutes together. You skip time. Like, you played like you already do, but time never pauses. You don't just get to pause in the middle of anything. And that's what it is. That's the real time. That's an AD&D that I still haven't seen the bros explore, and nobody else gets even close to it.
Well, there's a lot of stuff in one either. Like, I haven't seen many people explore the we've talked about how the DM is ranking the players based on how they performed their role, and their alignment is also like, you're given a chart that you're supposed to like plot the character's alignment based on their decisions and see if it starts drifting away from who they are. That's something that we don't really talk about as the bros. It's like, does anybody do that? Is anyone tracking alignment by choice per player?
That was another. I'm sorry. I know we're trying to wrap up.
Go ahead.
That was another thing that was in our 3.5 edition campaign when we were playing. We could write down what alignment we wanted to be on our character sheet, but in the background, and he told us this. He's like, if you're doing something of another alignment, you're switching alignment. And that's just what's going to happen. And this is just the way he played. If you ever turn to evil, then you become an NPC, and he plays you.
Okay.
He plays the bad guys. And
that
so that was kind of
like Star Wars West End games D6, where like you go to the dark side and then you got to turn over your sheet.
Yeah, and that was how he played it, and that was fine, but it did keep you thinking along those lines.
Yeah. Man, I cannot believe 2 hours has already gone by. Are you kidding me? This was such a fun conversation.
Yeah, I love it.
We had a lot to talk about. I feel like we just scratched the surface. I feel like this is one of my better episodes. Sweet. Thanks for coming on, Alchemic Raker.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Final thoughts for people that are like just watching this for the first time and being like, I have never read Chainmail. I don't know about this mass combat thing. What advice would you give them on how and why to do this?
Check out Chainmail, or not Chainmail. Check out HellMarch, see the examples of play in there. This fits right into the games you're already running. It's just new opportunities. These are not heavy rules. This mass combat just like adds to the options that your players have, and it makes them even more heroic. It gives them more of those opportunities. It's not more dangerous for them. It actually tends to be safer. If they've got men around them, then that's like, it's codified as like extra beating that they can take. Even if they lose a fight in mass combat, their men run away, and the player characters are the last ones to take damage out of a troop of men. And those men are running away before they're all dead, which means the player characters are alive.
Yeah.
Right. So mass combat, like throwing a bunch of bad guys at your players, is safer when you've got these mass combat rules.
Yeah.
Like it really does just enhance the game when you have these mass combat rules on hand for whenever you need them. And if you want to see the quality of the work that I do, you can get the Old Lords for free on drive-thru.
Yeah, it's pay
Check
what
it
you
out.
want.
And you can see, I do great layouts and stuff. Chainmail's pretty crunchy, so the Old Lords is just packed with stuff. But you open up ShadowDark and you see how that's laid out. HellMarch is the same way. This is the ShadowDark of Chainmail, and it's what your players will be happy to pick up and play. And yeah, I definitely recommend you try it.
Heck yeah. So Alchemic Raker, you guys need to follow him on X if you're not already doing that. He drops cool stuff like the dice thing. Drive-thru RPG. I got the link in the description if you want to pick up HellMarch. And if you want to encourage us, let us know that you enjoyed the episode. Go ahead and give us a thumbs up. And if you want to see more stuff like this, you can subscribe to This is Dundermoose. Thanks for being with us, guys. We'll see you next time. Have a good one.